I can't hear any of that, but it sounded interesting. I think that was Persian traditional music, Jean-Jerome.
That's right.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, welcome to everybody who's joining us this Saturday. To me, it's morning. I know it's noon, but for me, it's morning. So welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight, today. We have a special guest, Andrea Savar, and of course, my co-host, Jean-Jerome Baudry. If you could be so nice as to give us a little bit of Andrea's background, we'll get started. Okay?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, Andrea. It's beautiful to have you on with us.
Thank you.
And a big shout out to all our guests and as well as our listeners that are watching right now. Claire, hello. How are you? Good morning.
Hi, Claire.
So, Andrea wears many hats in this life, including a mother, a gallery owner, jewelry designer, artist, and author. But the one that she says goes to her core is that of a practitioner of the mystic arts. Andrea's learning began as a child with a family that nurtured all of her unique gifts in a tradition that combined the Italian ways with the Pacific Northwest pioneer life and Persian mysticism. The first lessons in the old ways took place in the garden, where plants and their magical properties were passed down from one generation to the next. The language of gemstones is also part of an enduring tradition, as Andrea was often swept away with the family in search of unusual gemstones and antiquities. Growing up with gem importers for parents and gemologists, grandfather, the songs and stories of each stone have been present since childhood. It is the deeply held belief that woven through the story, ancestral food, and connections to the land, the mystical life is one that is best when shared with others. This has led to the creation of a one-year course Andrea is teaching with Inner Alchemy Collective, delving into the ways that we can work with the plant world as we would with our ancestors. Very interesting subject. And a shout out to Dr. Gianmichael Salvato, our friend and our previous guest and brother. Many blessings, and we always wish you the best, my brother. Published works from Andrea are The Curious Ways of the Wind Ships, A Curious Spring Fever, The Curious Voyage of a Lost Soul. That one sounds very interesting. Evolutionary Air, The Curious Coloring Book, Fairy Forest. Oh, definitely another one interesting. The Curious Coloring Book, and this is a good one. Mermaid Lagoon. Okay, now we're talking my language. Okay. Andrea's education, she has a BA in foreign language from Seattle University and Université de Grenoble, a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Seattle University. Very interesting. Postgraduate degree from Seattle Pacific University and language education. So for those that believe that people who practice the mystic arts are strictly people in the humanities or sociology, no, we have a mathematician among us.
Yes.
So there we go.
It's the balance. It's all about the balance.
Right. Absolutely.
And if anybody wants to reach Andrea, please visit her website at www.andreasavar.com.
Perfect.
Over to you, Teresa.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jean-Michael. He must be talking about me right now. God, you know what? It's Saturday. I'm just not here yet.
You gotta get the coffee. Crack out the Java. That's it.
I only had one cup. That's my problem, right?
That's criminal.
More Java. It's Saturday more Java.
No, for sure. Okay, so let me start this again. Boom, boom. Okay. Good morning to everybody and welcome, Andrea. I am so excited about having you here. Okay, and Jean-Jerome, once again, good morning and good morning to everybody. All right, so here we are. Okay, so what I want to do is start with, as Jean-Jerome said, you are a person who wears many hats. And as a mother, a gallery owner, jewelry designer, and a practitioner in mystical arts. So I want to begin today to talk about your childhood And if you can talk about that with us and share the uniqueness of your family and the mysticism that surrounds you to this day. Can you
Sure.
start?
I would love to.
Thank you.
Well, I think I grew up in a very small town in the Pacific Northwest called Port Townsend, and the town kind of has its own very very rich sense of place. It has a very kind of interesting history, and it's a Victorian seaport type of town, but it's very isolated. So it has 3 sites of water, and it's just, yeah, it has this incredible natural richness there.
Yeah.
But we're, isolated. So when I'm 3 generations from there on my mother's side, so the Italian side of the family settled there. And because of that, that's where we put down roots. And in doing so, we grew our gardens and we were very much part of the land. And so how I grew up was in a Victorian house with wood as our only heat source, our only cooking source. My mother cooked on a wood stove. So,
nice.
Cut her own wood. She grew all of our food. And there were shops in town, like dry goods at that time when I was little. I think there was a butcher. But we did a lot of clamming. We did a lot of foraging. So my mom baked all of our bread. Like, it was just very much a connection with the earth. And so I really grew up in that atmosphere of the garden. And my grandparents had acreage and grew cherries and grew apples and pears and all kinds of different herbs and plants. And they learned so much from other settlers that were there and the indigenous people that were there. Like, we would gather seaweed that we would incorporate into the garden as mulch because it brings minerals in the garden sphere. But it also had different spiritual aspects to it. So growing up in that, there was always this sense that the interconnection of everything was very present. Like, we weren't detached the way I think we are now in more modern spheres. Now that I live in the city, it's a little bit different. So there was that connection of, we all shared the same breath. Everything was this continuum. And so you would feel that energetic continuum in everything. And also, our town is kind of well known for having a lot of ghosts and spirits. It's like people don't want to leave there.
No kidding. I wouldn't want to. It sounds beautiful. Oh my God, it sounds magical. I love it.
Perfect for Teresa.
Right?
I was going to say, I'm coming over.
I know. And so I think for me, like, growing up with that, I know my first experience with the spirit world, if you will, was around age 3 that I remember. And I just, I didn't understand that it was something different, that I was seeing something that other people weren't experiencing in the same way. And so in our old house, this Victorian house in Uptown, there was a parlor. And parlors, nobody ever uses parlors. Like, they just kind of sit there. It's only when someone comes over and we want to feel fancy, you go in the parlor. So the parlor was always kind of dark, and there was a doorway, and on the other side of the parlor was more the living room space with the big, wood stove and
with those doors that you pull back, the rolling doors. Yeah,
exactly. And so my mom always left those doors open, and I was always, or often, talking to the man who lived in the parlor, and I called him Fox, and he was this very benevolent spirit that was there. And I would always smell tobacco smoke, like pipe smoke, whenever Fox was around. So it was kind of there. And so when I was 3, my uncle, and I'm sure I'll talk about him later, but he had left a chess set in one of in one of the drawers, but hadn't played it for years. Like I had never seen anyone play chess. And Fox told me where to find the chessboard. And so I brought it out and I sat right at that portion of the door where you're neither in or out. You're just kind of in that little in-between space, the liminal. And so I set it there and he taught me how to set up the chessboard. And so I set it out perfectly. And my mom came in the room and saw me, you know, with this perfectly set up chessboard, sitting on the light side of the door, talking to the dark on the other side. And she was like, you know, kind of got a little freaked out at first because she's like, is somebody in there? She thought it was an actual person at first who was, you know, a living person. And I said, no, I'm talking to Fox, and Fox is going to teach me a game. And so she like goes in, turns on the lights, checks the house because it was just me and her at that point, and calls my grandfather and is like, come take a look around, just make sure, you know, there's nobody lurking or anything. And when we, you know, it was confirmed that this was my spirit friend that I was speaking with, that's when she kind of, and the rest of the family started going, okay, well, we need to guide her in how to experience and how to work with this. So it wasn't something, but that was the moment that I realized there was another world. To me, it was just the same, you know, it was all the same.
It's as natural as this world. No, exactly. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, there was no separation. And later when I was researching my books, because my 2 first books are set in Port Townsend, and there's a lot of the history. I was in the archives doing a lot of research, and just kind of, it popped in my head, I should check our street and see if there was anything about Adams Street and about someone named Fox. And the ladies at the archives helped me kind of dig, and there was a James Fox that lived on our street. We couldn't pinpoint the house because there were a couple that were kind of built at the same time, and he had committed suicide in the 20s after the crash. So the Great Depression. So it's quite likely. Exactly.
But that's fascinating that, you know, James that Fox. You were able to do that and actually find that he existed.
Yeah. Small town stuff. You know, the nice thing is you can dig around.
Yeah. No, for sure. What a confirmation though for you, you know, especially, you know, saying his name and finding all of that out. But what a beautiful story. Oh my God. You know, that reminds me of the TV series Charmed, when they lived in that big Victorian house. And it reminds me a little bit about the movie Practical Magic, right? You know,
I
the
love
2
that.
sisters living.
Yes.
An ideal way to grow up. Good for you, Andrea. I think that's amazing.
That was filmed here. Part of the Practical Magic was filmed here on Whidbey Island, which is just across from Port Townsend. So you take a ferry from Whidbey to downtown Port Townsend. But it's not a real house, unfortunately. They just built it for a set and took it down. But our houses are like that.
Oh, beautiful. Oh my God. I love that. I think that's amazing. So I'm going to take you from there to talking about your connection with the plant kingdom. And when did you first realize, I know, you know, you have a connection to spirit and being able to talk to them, but how did that translate to the plant kingdom? Can you take us through your journey and talk a little bit about, I know your grandmother had a lot of influence on you and teaching you those ways. So if you can sort of take us through that, okay?
I think it was kind of pretty much the same time, because just like the spirit world, the human spirits were just like breathing for me, like everything else. I felt the same way about the plants. Like they came to me in the same way that a person would come to me. So if you think about, like I, as a child, and there are child plants that are very specifically communicate really easily, I think, with children and with people in general, like dandelions, nasturtium. Certain trees are incredibly welcoming, cherry trees especially. And since my Italian grandparents had the cherries, there was this, cherries are connected to lifeblood, and there's this idea with cherry juice that when during certain magical workings, you can use cherry juice in place of lifeblood if that cherry tree is on, if you've cultivated and cared for that cherry tree, because it has our same, we have this connection that's familial, that's ancestral. And so I think it was even just in that process of picking the cherries, canning them, going through this whole cycle of that we do with our plants, ingesting it, knowing that these things are sustaining us and we're sustaining them, that kind of became, it was very fluid as a child. So I didn't miss it. Yeah, I didn't really pinpoint it or dissect it the way that I would now as an adult. I think when you're a child, and this is true for all children, all people, I think we all have this. There's no special gift. It's just something we all have. And if it's nurtured, it grows. But it's fluid, like we're in that space. And the same thing with the rock, the same thing with,
yes.
I was even extremely, I think maybe a little bit too much this way when I was a child, but I felt it in everything. So even when I would make my bed, I would carefully put my pillows on the bed because I didn't want to make them feel bad if I threw them on the bed.
That's so cute.
Extreme, but so there was a reverence for just
right
around me because you could feel the movements of it all.
Right.
And then later, as I got older, that's when, when you're before the age of 7, it's kind of this, we think of it as this time when the child is still dreaming. Mm-hmm. So we should leave them in that dream state. We should let them absorb and be children and not burden them with too much of what the concrete world has become. Like they should still have that softness because they're integrating their spirit into this time and space.
Absolutely.
From whatever past life, from whatever they need to, whatever their work is going to be at this particular time. So there wasn't as much, the teaching was subtle, It was
no.
But then as I grew older, it manifested in the way we cook. And I started understanding, especially, and this is a little bit later when my mother remarried, and she married a Persian man who my stepdad, who I love and adore, and they really adopted me as one of their own. Like there was no, my grandmother on that side would always say, we find family where the spirits bring us.
Absolutely.
So there is blood, but there's also something more that connects us. And so she was the one who kind of broke things down a little bit more, like when you're rolling dolma, what that means. Because in Persian tradition, everything is rich with symbolism and purpose. So even something as simple as the action of picking a grape leaf has the spiritual symbolism. Or in springtime, like around Nowruz, which is our Persian New Year, we cook a noodle soup that's called gashte, ashashte, and it's or ash is kind of more commonly called ash, and it has all of these, all of the greens, so the symbols of the spring and vitality, but it also has these long kind of linguine-esque Persian noodles. And they symbolize, as you're eating them, that each one is a road, your path, on your spiritual path, that is straightening and unwinding. So you're unraveling any complexities, anything that you need to kind of unravel and let go of. You're doing that with the noodle.
I love that. Oh my God, that's so magical. Really.
When it's like so much.
I'm going to start eating noodles in a different way. It's amazing. It really is. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, what Italians do a similar thing, but we do it with cord, and it goes back to the symbolism of the faiths. So we unwind or we knot when we need to stick something. Just
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, for sure. So, I wanted to ask you about so gathering all of this knowledge. And by the way, I'm entranced by your storytelling. I love that. It sounds beautiful. A wonderful way to grow up and to be able to be taught from your elders in a way that just brings all that magic together and weaves it together. I'm not going to eat noodles now in any other way than looking at them as unraveling of my road, my path. My mother used to make her own pasta, right? Growing up Polish, we were very much to the land as well, but she used to make these kluski, and they were these long things. They were like this. Some of them were fat, whatever, but I'm now, if I'm going to eat them, and I do make them sometimes, I'm going to try it myself, and I'm just going to be thinking of the road, really. I love that idea. That's wonderful.
And we do that in all the cooking. So, for example, like anything that seems mundane, like peeling a potato or cutting up ginger or anything that might have sort of this idea of, oh, it's just a common task, all of those things can be made sacred. So when you're peeling a potato, or cutting something like a root vegetable, you're actually grounding yourself. When you're opening an onion, and this is probably the most like symbolic that I think everyone across cultures understands the layers of an onion. So when you're cutting an onion, you're peeling back anything that might need to be revealed, or something that is bothersome, like it's irritating to your eyes. So you're getting in there and you're kind of working with that, and you're doing that not only in the physical manifestation, but because you're bringing that energy to a pinpoint in that moment and giving it an anchor, you're also doing it in the spirit level. So it's in tandem.
Yeah, with intention and purpose and focus.
Exactly. And same thing with, this crosses into so many things, like dance, for example, is the same. It's a very similar action. You're moving your physical body because you're bringing in spirit. And so there's all these different aspects to that, and how something that might seem purposeless, if you will,
or mundane, you bring purpose to it, and focus, and it becomes almost ritualistic and very present and aware. That I love. Sounds beautiful to me. Jean-Jerome, you look like you want to say something at this point, so I'm just going to let you interject here. Did you want to say something?
No, keep going. I don't want to break we're in a very good thing. I was just saying intention, that they do it with a lot of intention.
Yes, focus and intention. And we do that so when we're planting plants, we do the same thing. And I think for me too, like now that my grandparents have both passed on, sometimes there's this feeling of, but I still, work with them on the spirit level. But when you think about what are my other ancestors, and I think this was kind of one of the things that led me to design this course and kind of dive a little deeper in it, was I was seeing so many people that were feeling really disconnected from not just their human ancestors, but the earth itself, and the ancestors and or maybe not having, or having human ancestors that maybe were troubling, like there were things that were connecting with them, like they were having a hard time because of trauma, and that trauma was healed. But in the interim, we have the plants as our wisdom holders and our ancestors, and they're here to help. I think they're here to help more than anyone. They have no other intention other than being part of our interconnection. So
very present, being very present, and yeah.
And so looking to them as another line of our ancestors opens up a whole realm of possibility of exchange and work and communion that I think has sort of been overlooked in our modern societies.
I I agree. I totally agree. No, for sure. I wanted to ask you, sorry, I got carried away with listening to you and I forgot about my questions here. Fascinating. I love this. With your connection with the plant kingdom, the plant people, as I like to call them.
Me too.
The yes, and thank you, Claire. Awesome. I feel your vibes. Yes, my Claire does feel vibes, and my girl. I wanted to ask you about your course that you are developing with Inner Alchemy. That's the Inner Alchemy Collective. This is part of the show, or that you're a co-host. First of all, I just want to establish that you're a co-host with Michael on Masca and the Mystic. Okay. And you also have developed this collective called Inner Alchemy. And so I want to talk a little bit about the course that you have put together, and to tell us about how you're able to present this course. I think it's a year long, isn't that what it is?
Yeah, and you can jump in anytime. Like, it's one of those ones where it's on demand, so it's not, you don't have to be, if you
There's no beginning or no whatever, you just keep going.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. So I wanted to ask you about, there's teachable ways and practices. Now, do you do something on a daily basis that keeps you so connected to the plant kingdom that you're able to, let's say, teach those steps or those teachable ways?
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty much a way of life for me, so I don't really have, every day has some type of working that involves the plant world. And that comes, now is a quieter time because we're in the winter here in the Northern Hemisphere. So the garden isn't necessarily where I'm going to be doing most of my work. Whereas in the spring, summer, fall, I'm out there every day. And my parents have a small herb farm, flower and herb farm, just 12 minutes from where we live. So we're always kind of over at the farm. Because of COVID, we are all distant. They stay on the porch, and we're, in the garden part and in the wetlands. But hopefully, as the time goes on, we can all be working again, kind of in the same space. But so for us, it's this, there's all of the rituals of just the garden. But I don't want people to feel like if they don't have a garden that they can't do this, because these are things you also do inside, especially winter. Like the last that I just finished up was for February, and I tie in a lot of the ways that we look at Lupercalia, which was on the 15th of February, but there's a lead up to it that starts with the last moon in January, and lead up to Lupercalia, which is the ancient Roman tradition. But there are a lot of symbols that kind of work with that particular tradition that also connect to the land. And so when I taught that particular module, it was more about understanding what things in our lives need to be culled, need to be removed, because that's a lot of what the wolves do. And, in a forest situation, they are the ones who call the deer population, which also are a menace for the plant population. So it kind of becomes this big circle of life, and how everything is interconnected in that way, and how we incorporate that into our lives and work. And so I have, that one was kind of a specific month where I did more because of winter, things you can do in your personal life inside, bringing certain things to the indoors, like aloe vera, violets, like violets, plants that have incredible healing presence, especially in the dark months, that you can grow. And just having them near you has its own benefits and mutual benefits. So it's not just a one-way kind of street.
Right.
But I started the class initially earlier in the year because, John Michael and I were just chatting on, personally, just on our own time. And we were talking about different plants and our, the Italian ways, and kind of working through some of those things, and just, bouncing ideas off of each other. We do. And I was like, I think I'm going to do some little tutorials, just like 5-minute little things I'm just going to put up on my Facebook about what's popping up in the garden, because it was that early spring. We were in quarantine. Now, that was a year ago. And because we're in Washington State, in Seattle, we were one of the first places that had one of the first cases of COVID. So we shut down early. And I could feel people obviously distressed. It was extremely difficult for people to be locked away. And I really, I need to do something so people know they're not alone. Like, this is not alone in the world. Even if they're away from humans, they are surrounded by other benevolent, loving spirits.
Energies and spirits, yeah.
Exactly. And so I went out in the garden, and I think the first one I did, it was dandelion, because they were just popping up. And I wanted to show how dandelion is one of those plants, it's spirits, that is playful, incredibly beneficial for your physical system, but also your spiritual path, because they take you back to childhood. They're one of those plants that, parents don't care if you go pick a million dandelions.
No.
And they're hardy and strong, and so they have perseverance ingrained into their species. And so when you're picking that and when you're ingesting, as long as it's in an untreated area, of course, the leaves become they look like little spears, or in French, it comes from de lion, which is lion tooth.
Okay.
They become a way for you to be a warrior in your life, to persevere, to remain strong, to strengthen your body, your spirit, your mind. And so they are an ally in that. And just taking a moment to just sit with the dandelion. So I started doing those just randomly, and weird plants, not just dandelion, but plants that people think are weeds and they ignore, but have benefits if you incorporate them into your diet. So things like chickweed or purple dead nettle. We use purple dead nettle for pesto in the early spring before we can have basil. And it has all these incredible properties. So I started doing it that way, just as a way to share comfort.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. Just those simple things. And it's true, because when you think about weeds, you go out there and yet in the crack of cement sidewalk, there's this little tiny plant that just survives, and it's strong and it comes through, and you have to admire it. You really have to, admire that spirit that it has. Good for you. Oh my God. This is amazing. This course sounds really beautiful, because you take it through the different seasons, and anyone can just kind of jump in and join, right?
Exactly. And January, I started off with the introduction, but the introduction was, I focused on 2 specific plants that are really important to both of the traditions that I'm kind of most ingrained in my life. So the Persian and the Italian, and the Italian was the olive tree. And I call it grandfather olive, and how to connect with grandfather olive tree. And then on the Persian side, it was grandmother pomegranate.
Grandmother, sorry? I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, pomegranate, yes.
Pomegranate. And so I go through, in my lecture, there's a lecture portion where I go through the history, why these plants are important to human civilization. But then I break it down into what the spirits are and how we work with them in everything from a journeying way to in our daily life. And then I put in extra portions that will be recipes, spells. I teach how to make incense with the pomegranate peels. I do how to make a pomegranate scrub for your face with olive oil. And then, of course, I think the last one I wrote something a little more on the mystical side of things, which was the connection that St. Francis of Assisi had with the olive tree, and how that kind of was woven, and not in a religious aspect, but in a mystical, all traditions.
Absolutely, absolutely. People forget that, when we talk about working with saints, that it's strictly a Catholic belief system or something, but it isn't. If you look beyond and look to what the saint represents, or what, you know,
Yeah,
um, that link we can have, regardless of our belief systems, right? So, no, it
exactly.
sounds no, it sounds amazing though. That's so nice. I like the way you incorporate all of that, into this. So, if someone were to be interested in this course, where would they go to be able to sign up for this?
The best thing is, I'll give you guys a link too that we can maybe put up, because I think there's a specific link that you can use to get on, and you can have 7 days free to kind of go through the whole platform, because it's
Oh,
not just my class. You actually, by joining it, it's like a social media platform, and so you can have your own little page. I have a group of my own plus the course material. So you can join my group, and I post things about plants very, very often. Articles, things I write, things other people write, medicinal information. But there's also other amazing practitioners that are part of this collective, like Jim Sayers, and he has his own course on herbal allies as well. Of course, John Michael, there's the 26 weeks
yes.
Playground course, which is fabulous. And there are other courses that are being added. There's a course that Dominic also does that is about African traditional religion. And then there's I think he's going to actually move. I think he's going to also be doing a tarot class, but like a course on tarot. So there's a lot happening there, and we're just starting it. So I know it's growing, but it's still it's very intimate still. It's a really neat group of people. And the people that are on there, I feel like there's this openness, this really genuine desire to learn and share. And there's no gatekeepy stuff. This is open to all religions, all traditions, all paths.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to create a place of support and not a place of, breaking people down and putting them in boxes. So you can pop in, I think, for free for 7 days and just check it out. See if it's your something that interests you or you feel connected there. And then after that, it's $49 a month, and that gives you access to everything. And more classes added. So
Yes. I remember Michael asking me, and I'm thinking about it. I definitely
I
am. So
know. We would
it
love to have
sounds,
both of you teach courses
yeah,
on there.
no,
And I think there's
I would.
going to be a class on Catholic conjure. Oh, and Adam. Oh my goodness, how could I forget? Adam Darkley is amazing, and he does a whole class on hoodoo, which is
Is this
unbelievable.
Adam?
Yeah, Adam Conjure.
Adam
Adam
Conjure?
Darkley.
Yes. He's a sweet guy. I really,
Oh, I
really
love
love
Adam.
him too. I can
And
make such a connection to him too. He's
me too.
wonderful. Yeah.
Adam, if you're watching, I have a little spirit crush.
You too? Okay. I know. I have a bunch of spirit crushes on a few of our guests and that. He's kind of like my cutie too.
But his class is amazing, and it goes through it's really, really, really good. So I'm taking his classes. I love it. So yeah, so it's a very
That sounds
welcoming city.
wonderful. Yeah, no, it sounds wonderful. I love that. And at some point in time, definitely I think I'll join. Sorry, I have my dog here. She's kind of in that mode of being protective or whatever, but right, Zola? Anyway. So yes, I love this. It sounds wonderful. And so anybody who's listening, please do, you know, connect
And
with Andrea or with
yeah,
what we have. Jean-Jerome, can you put something like us on StreamYard to connect
Yeah,
with
I will.
Kim? Or
and
later,
also,
I mean, anybody
and
can
you
go
can
on our
always
page.
they can always
Go ahead.
PM me on Facebook or send an
Right.
email, and I'll send the link on my Facebook
Absolutely.
page. And I've been doing this on my personal page. I think I'm going to start kind of the secondary one later. That's a group that just talks about plants. But I put up those little tutorials still that are just free. I mean, you can just,
Yeah.
the whole point was to create that connection for people. So they're on there, and you're welcome to follow my page. I think the last one I did was chickweed, and I'm probably going to do one pretty soon about either feverfew or angelica, because they're still garden.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Jean-Jerome, you've got, yes, right, exactly. Oh, well, I follow you, Andrea, obviously, and I love, and I have to say, I'm enthralled with the things that you do with your little girl. Okay, it's very cute. I watch her, and do you know what? She kind of reminds me what you probably would have been like as a child. Okay, that's what I'm always thinking. Every time I watch her, I feel like I'm watching you as a little girl too. Very, very sweet.
She's got a lot more fire. Like, I was very connected to water, the element water and earth. And so for me, I was very dreamy, like kind of in my own world, very much like if you took me to the beach, I would just sit at the water's edge for hours or get in. I wouldn't, there was that. She's got a lot of the fire, like my mother.
Yeah.
My mom, it's all fire. Fire and air. I call her the magical nuclear option when things need to get done.
Oh, sweet. She's very, very cute. So, okay, I think this is wonderful, and I encourage everybody to be able to tune in to Andrea and definitely make a link there. I know I'm interested for sure. So I'm going to ask another question about your books, because I know that you are an author of a few books, and I wanted to talk briefly about the books you've written and what your inspiration was for these books. The first one, The Curious of the Windships.
Curious
What
Ways
is
of the
that?
Windships. Well,
Curious
for
Ways of
us,
the Windships.
because we don't really have a name for the Italian side, there is no name for the practice. It's called the unnamed path. So we don't call ourselves witches. The outside world most definitely has and does. But it's not, and I have no problem with that word. If anything, I think probably my generation will be the one, and my daughters too.
That brings it back.
Yeah. But that wasn't a word that they would have used in our past. So we could just call it the ways. So it was just like, oh, well, those are just, the things that we do. Those are just the ways. And it was the path, if you will. So The Curious Ways of the Windships, the first book, is very autobiographical, but I had to make it fiction. I couldn't just, at that time when I wrote the first one back in 2012, I wasn't ready yet to be completely transparent with just the things that we do and how we are. And I think fiction,
I get that, yeah.
and I think fiction was this incredible vehicle, as storytelling is, to connect with people on many different levels. So people who have that spiritual knowledge will recognize certain things. People who are not at all interested in spirituality will still be able to read it and enjoy it and become part of the story. And I feel like I wanted it to be as accessible as possible. And so I chose that format. And it also helped me with dates, and I could change names that I needed to. But there's probably 70 to 80% that are completely like autobiographical and really, really close.
You.
Well, in my family, because it's multi-generational in the book. So it's not just, there's the young character who's the main character, but you get her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and then the people in the town, from the young children to the elders. Like, there's a community. And I felt like I needed to show that interconnection. We aren't ourselves alone on an island. We have all of these connections and all of these things working together. And then I wove in all the elements, because that's a very important part of how we work. So kind of reiterating how almost each person is sort of born with a connection to one or multiple elements and how to kind of become an elemental when we're looking. So there's kind of that portion, and just the subtle ways that we bring in the different spirit work. But the first book is based largely on my uncle.
Yes.
From a young person's point of view. So this wasn't really this is from a 20-year-old perspective in the main character. I'm working on the 5th book right now, which will be in his voice, which really will be a much different experience. But I just, at that time in my life, I had these very clear messages that I should write this book. And it kind of came from a trip to Port Townsend with some friends of mine that are musicians, and they were playing a concert there. And I'm like, okay, if you're going to go play there, they were on tour. And I'm like, I'll go and give you the official ghost tour, if you will, of my hometown. And so we went along for the weekend, and I was just, as I was telling them, oh yeah, this is, the house that Captain, Cook built. This is, all these different places, and talking about the different metaphysical or the paranormal aspects that were incorporated into each part of town and the historical aspects. I was thinking, my family's been a part of this for 3 generations, and we have this generational knowledge of this land. I would love to kind of find a way to share that story. And so it slowly came. And with my uncle, who was a very interesting person, a practitioner, very much in his own, very powerful in his own ways. He was also very burdened, I think, by some of that, and had to work through a lot of that in his youth. So his story culminated in a death that was in a car accident, and it felt like a very sudden, very early death for us. And I feel like I need to go back and give him a way to live a little bit longer in a different facet. And so I was telling his part of the story, but in a way that was veiled enough where it wasn't going to upset anybody. And so that's kind of how that came through. And so a lot of it was, when I write, I am, listening to what the family saying from the other side, and that really became incorporated into the first book. So there's a lot of that mystery there. And then the second had some interesting things. I wrote it in 2013, but just recently, when a friend of mine, when the beginning of the pandemic happened, and I looked back. It's about a plague that happens 100 years apart, and it happens on it's a fever plague, and it happens on a leap year. There's this whole connection to rats, and there's, of course, last year was the year of the rat, and it was a leap year. And there were a bunch of other elements that came in there that were a little frightening. When it's always hindsight is 2020. When you look at it, it's like, oh, I see what was happening here.
Very prophetic in a way too, when you think about it.
And I wrote that one in 3 months. It was the fastest novel I've ever written. It was the most complex because I had to bounce between these two 100-year plagues. And it was just kind of interesting how they paralleled, and then they paralleled again what was happening in 2020. And so it was kind of interesting to look back on it. That one definitely, I felt like, didn't even come from me. It just came from.
No kidding. And that's the one that's called a curious spring fever. Yeah. Right. Interesting. Very, very interesting. I love that. I love the way your story is interweaved with your own personal autobiography, and your family life. And again, it incorporates that uniqueness that you grew up with. Yeah. Very important. I love
the third one, which is kind of it's set in France, and I lived in France for a decade, and my husband is French, and so I probably speak more French on a daily basis than I do English.
Yes, I know you speak to Violette, your daughter, and
Violette.
And that one's called The Curious Voyage of a Lost Soul, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that
Go
has
ahead.
a lot
Tell
to
me.
do with soul reclaiming, but also some of the older traditions. I studied in the Alps where I lived. And in the Alps where I lived in Voiron and Grenoble, and Voiron and Saint-Pierre-de-Chartreuse are really interesting parts of the Alps because there's a medicinal plant kind of community there that goes all the way back to the Père Chartres, the monks that live in that same town. And they have an elixir that's called Chartreuse, which I think most people are familiar with the alcohol, the Chartreuse alcohol. It's a green.
Not.
Oh, we love it.
Yes. Yes. No, I do. Yes, I do. Okay. Yes.
Kind of like
The
the
shark,
Genevieve,
the green.
but it's
Yes.
not. It's Chartreuse.
Like Benedict. Yeah.
Really good. And they make, in addition to the alcohol, there's actually a remedy that is made, and it goes back to when Saint Bruno came to the mountains, but there's all of this lore around it that has to do with Isis and her presence in the Alps and her presence in Paris and how it is interwoven into the land there to be this connection with the wolves that were there. So that is what I really try to incorporate. And we have very much these same traditions in the Italian ways. And my Italian family is also from the mountains, from the Dolomites, northern Italy. And so there's this connection to the wolves, to the Black Madonna, to the way that it worked with the plants as an intermediary, as a way to heal. Some of the sacred books that were brought to that area, and also how certain plants that grow there are thought to be part of an elixir of life, but also an elixir of transformation. And that could be shape-shifting, we don't know. There's a lot of aspects to that. But there's like Herb Robert, that's one of them. And I talk about Herb Robert on one of my tutorials. And that kind of connection there. But so that's what the third book is actually set in France and is much more focused on the old, the ways in the Alps. That, living there for that long, I was able to connect there too.
Oh my God, that sounds fascinating, beautiful. What a lovely life story, and to bring that to books, like, yeah, I have to read them. Okay. And then we have your other book called Evolutionarium. And
it's a short book.
Sorry?
It's a short little novella. I don't know if you've read that one.
No. I didn't read that one, but I know you had sent me a connection but I briefly did. But can you sort of tell us like why that element in particular?
That one came really strong, like that particular series, and that will be a series of 5 small novellas. So the first one is Air, and that's the one that's already published, the Evolutionarium Air. I think eventually I'm just going to publish like one book with all of them in it, just make it like a volume. But it's set in a timeless place, obviously on Earth, but there's the great change has happened in this particular book. I believe we call it the Great Change, and the other ones will be like the Great Wave will be part of the Water Book, and the Great Fire for the Fire Book, and so there's all of these different elements. But it's about our connection to the Earth, our connection to the elementals, but how we are needing to adapt and shift and become more conscious. It's a very simple book from the outside. Like it looks like it would be almost a children's book because I illustrated it with very simple black and white drawings. And so this first one is about a little boy named Jasper who is just born into that doesn't quite understand him, and he's feeling this evolution happening all around him. it has to do with, like, there's, the way I write it is if you look at all the different details, there's details of birds in everything. So, he likes eating grasshoppers. It's like a delicacy. There's this, in my mind, it's set in Hong Kong or in Japan, in one of those high rises. Like if you go to Hong Kong, you see the high rises, and they have, or especially in Kowloon when you're, going there, it's, there's all of these homes, and you see this interaction, and it almost reminds me of sort of like a multi-level chicken coop. Like it has that kind of feel to it where we're enclosed, but we're still kind of bustling and moving. And I love Hong Kong, by the way. That's one of my places. So I love it there. But there's this energy that kind of happens, and it's how we've become so
it's hustle and bustle.
It's very hustle and bustle, but we've become almost so disconnected that we don't even see how we are using a type of biomimicry almost animal species or different plant species, and how we are part of this. We're not separate. So there's this whole interconnection. I don't want to give anything away because there's a little mystery in it. But there's mathematical aspects too in it. I put in some of the little drawings, you'll see like there's a little candle, and it has the equation for flight that kind of moves up into the ether. So there's all this air that kind of comes through.
And again, that thread of mysticism.
And then the next one, I'm writing them all kind of in tandem, but there's Earth is in Alaska, and it's about a little girl named Ivy who was born with a radish where her heart should be. But she's so cute. And then there's the water one is a little girl named Mercuria, and it's in somewhere in the South Pacific. I'm thinking it feels very Tahiti, Bora Bora, and she's there, and there's been a tsunami, and they're at the very top of the mountain now, which is where her grandmother survived the tsunami by being called by spirit to go to the top of the mountain. And her grandmother's like this barnacle that just sits there and has a shell house, and there's all these aspects of that. So it's and then fire is set in Vegas, which Las Vegas, and there's this problem of human combustion.
And there we have.
Oh yeah, and there's all the links there. All the books are on Amazon. The two last ones are coloring books, because I have a small child and we love to color.
I was going to say the connection is to your motherhood, right? And being able to teach her through color and bring these characters, the fairies of the forest, the mermaid, and wonderful. I love that.
That's easy. And those are for adults and children. They're for any age. You can color away.
I have coloring books. I've colored, and I still like coloring. Sometimes it's just being able to just sit there and just kind of let your mind drift while you're taking color. And
that's one of my paintings.
Color to purpose.
Those are my little illustrations, the painting.
Yes, nice. So, okay, I'm just going to move along to your jewelry. I love watching your jewelry and how you make your jewelry. There are so many pieces where I go, I want that one. No, that one. And then it's like, and then the next day you show something else, and I go, okay, so if I had to have a choice, would it be that? And I actually go back to the other ones, to the other jewelry pieces, right? And I go, oh my God, so which one would I really, really want? So can you tell us a little bit about what inspires you? I mean, obviously, I think it would be nature and everything, but each one is so unique, and where you actually get your pieces. So if you could just give us a little bit about that.
My parents were gem inventors. I grew up in a family where we had a strong connection with not only the plants, but when my mom remarried and moved to the city with my dad, we would travel and go all over the world to find specimens, find in the beginning, it was actually, we were doing more, we were following some of my dad's leads in the Middle East. So it was more in Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is obviously before the current wars, and I still kind of go there a little easily, and bringing back a lot of tribal pieces. And then it kind of shifted as we couldn't go to those places anymore.
Right.
Because it was too dangerous. We were going more to Indonesia or Hong Kong, Thailand. And we found, or Nepal, my parents have spent a considerable amount of time in Nepal and in Tibet. And they were, my dad is very much, even though his family is, Persian, they're Persian mystic, he is very drawn to the Buddhist religion. That's something that's been very important for him. So he built relationships. My parents built relationships with the people there who were carvers, who were finding these stones, a lot of antique or vintage specimens. So we're not really, we try to be mindful of the mining aspects that occur. My metals, I recycle them. So I tend to, like, as I work on things, I melt and then reform into something new. So I'm not, I don't feel at this time we should be depleting the way that we are. And my parents, thankfully, very much felt the same way. But because people in those particular parts of the world are dependent on that interconnection, we felt the best way to do that is to build relationships with people. And some of those relationships have lasted 30, 40 years for my parents, the same families where the carving traditions or the cutting traditions. My dad is also a gem cutter, so he cuts a lot of the stones down for me. But those traditions are taught and passed down within those families. So we're having that connection with them that is multi-generational now. So I can call up, our friend Gunn in Nepal and say, hey, how are you guys doing? Do you have any of these carvings, or could you make them? And so there's this, connection there. My dad recently found a specimen of agar wood. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Agar wood. It's old specimen. This is before the pandemic. He took it to Indonesia and to his friends there that are carvers. And we just got a box this past week, my parents did, of the carvings that they did, but any excess, so anything that was left over from the carvings, they made into incense cones for us. So we purchased the incense cones. So there's no waste. So we wanted to find people that had very similar spiritual connections and traditions. So we knew that even though there is going to be some impact, you can't live in this world without impacting it. The important thing is doing something in the return to hopefully balance that. Right. And so all my stones have come from those travels. I use a ton of vintage pieces, and then when I would go to the balcons, the flea market, and I would find interesting elements. Like this one is from Italy, but it's like, this is the mandelkorn, so it's the protection.
Right, the horn.
But it's 150 years old. So I would use these things that are antiques and reincorporate them. And then my husband and I have our own store and our own business that is actually based on French antiques and European antiques. And so our gallery here in Edmonds in Washington has a combination of my art, local art, handmade, and then French and Italian and English antiques, but nothing is mass produced.
Nice. So that's what your gallery is about, is incorporating up. Beautiful.
And
fascinating.
Too. So I'll have my parents, when we in the spring or the summer, I bring in bouquets. This is when we're kind of in a weird time, so we're not open right now. We're doing by appointment. I'm hoping in the spring we can reopen a little more easily. But it's we're definitely we bring in the fresh flowers. I make bouquets. So when I find the time. I don't sleep very much. I've got a little person too.
I know. I know, Andrea. I see you posting and that because I don't sleep that much either, right? But I think that's just part of what we do, right? You find that time when you're
Yeah.
that connected. You find that time. You make that time, right?
And I think when it's something that you love and it's something that feels purposeful, it doesn't really feel like work in the same way that other things do. It becomes a practice and a habit and a way of moving in the world.
A way of life. No, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it sounds like a charmed life, and I love it. I really do. And Andrea, you are a delight. And I know that other people who are tuning in are just getting right into you just by the comments that I'm seeing. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to interview this before I hand it over to Jean-Jerome, who I know is itching to ask you a few questions. We don't want to keep you too much away from, I know you've got
and I'm
your
just
little
checking I'm just going to check my battery real quick on here. I might need to go grab a little do you mind if I grab my little Actually, I think it's okay. It looks like it's okay. Should be fine. It's supposed to have like 2 hours on there to 3 hours.
I was just going to say my battery too, but I think I'm good. I'm down to 20%, so I'm okay.
Because I don't want Violette to see me, because then she'll be like, "Ma."
Then she'll snag you.
Probably playing with her dad right now, so I'm just like, no, interrupt that.
That's good. That's good.
Well, that's good. That's good.
So,
go ahead.
Jean-Jerome, did you want to ask Andrea?
So it's a fascinating journey through the different aspects. I mean, the emphasis on the plants, the concepts of plants as being ancestors, and another spirit ally, living, breathing spirit ally, other than human spirits and so forth, that we typically sort of equate to. Also notice just some themes I've picked out and then lead to my question. Another thing very important, I noticed that in your practice, from what you describe, there's a very strong awareness or consciousness of the four elements, primary elements. Yeah, plus and the 5, right? And the 5th as well. In some cultures they define the 5th as metal, being a combination. Others define it differently. They define it as almost a spiritual element or the unseen element. So in that respect, what is the 5th? Let's talk about what is the 5th element in your practice, in your life experience, but also if you trace back to the Italian part of your heritage, and also very interestingly the Persian and the Persian mystic of your, which maybe people that are tuning in, as we were talking before the show, you talk about Persian, you talk about Iranian or Iran, because of the imposition of Islam and the Ayatollah system in Iran, and to some extent the suppression of other belief systems and religious and spiritual expression, but keeping in mind that Persia is the birthplace of many things, including many aspects of mysticism, one of the oldest monotheistic religions, Zoroastrianism, and also there's the Baha'i faith. There's many nuggets or gems, to use something that sort of matches with our discourse. Many gems or jewels of wisdom, pearls within the Persian. So how do you take a little bit through that aspect of, for instance, from the Italian side, from what you were taught and growing up, and from the Persian side, how they look at the really those concept development? Because just as a preface as well, within Vodun and even within Ifa, it is said really that Ifa is really governed or sort of divvied up by looking at the different elements. Yes. Right? Many within the aspect of Jodo is associated with many elements. Within Ifa Orisa practice, the various Orisha are again associated with different elements. Within Vodun practice, they definitely emphasize 5 elements and have divinity, primordial divinities, which encompass that. Like for Earth, Sakpata, for the fire, hevioso, for the air, sagbolisa, for the water, variation, either agbe or mamewata. So when you look at those different aspects, and then for the metal, what they call the fifth element, which is the fusion, the creativity, the innovation, and really the precursor, right, to the genesis, the explosion of humanity, is vodungu, which is the metal, right? And those same elements and those same sort of division, although not as emphasized, sometimes within the Yoruba Ifa or Risa side, are present, right? And in many things regarding Ifa, especially when you're offering to the elementals, right? Or which many people within Ifa don't speak in those terms, but really, many ways they are offering to elementals, to the difference in stars, to the nature. How does that work, or how were you taught from those two sides?
I'm gonna say pause because it did come up on my battery. I'm so sorry.
Okay, no
Let me
worries.
grab my cord. I don't want it to cut out. Let me grab it. I'll be right back.
No worries.
Okay.
No worries.
And Jean-Jerome, I was just going to say the same thing. I'm just going to I'm going to press my button at the back here, okay, of my battery pack. So just give me a sec.
Take your time.
All right. All right. So fascinating. Andrea Savar is a very fascinating person, and I'm so glad I was able to get her to come on the show. I asked her last year, but she couldn't make it. So I thought, well, definitely this year I want her on the show. And of course, lucky me, I was able to go on Gian Michael's and Andrea's show, Masca and the Mystic, and you and I both too. So that was a nice little treat. And here's Andrea. Andrea, I had to do the same thing.
I didn't want it to cut off in the middle. So
not a problem.
And it's so funny. I just did that and my light went off. I don't know. So this is a fascinating question, and one that I thought about a lot, especially when I was writing the first book, because the elementals are such a big part of it. For the Italian tradition, we do 5, and the 5th one is ether. So it's going to be the spirit. And ether also, we call it sometimes pneuma, which is sort of the breath of life, the breath of spirit that encapsulates all of them, all of the different elements. And so when I'm working, I'm just going to catch my breath because I bolted.
Oh, take your time, no rush.
Speaking of breath, I'm
take in some of that air element. Take in some of that air element right now.
I need to work out a little more here. Your quarantine has taken a toll. So one of the ways that we work with those particular elements is each person is, when they're born, is connected to usually at least one element, but oftentimes more. And then there are people who are like my uncle, who has a connection to all 5, and a much stronger connection to fire more than anything. But he had this sort of way of connecting to all 5 elements where you almost embody those elements. So when you're working, for example, when you're doing any type of healing work, we also, the plants are also associated with different elements. And so when we are doing certain types of, for example, I'm trying to think of a good one, but solar type of work that has to do with fire, we'll bring in plants that are like chamomile, which actually is kind of funny because it has the double, it's water and fire. We use those things to balance whatever workings we're doing. In the Persian tradition, it's a little bit different. And I've talked about this with John Michael sometimes too. While we have all the elements, there's this aspect of the north and the south. And the north holds earth, water, kind of combined, I believe, metal. There's also that element that's kind of mixed in there. we don't really talk about it as often. It seems to be kind of almost this idea of when you combine that with the southern elements, which are going to be the fire and the air, that they kind of commune and they create this middle element. The thing with the Persians too, at least from what I learned in my family, and this could be just specific to my family, there was this strong idea of a monotheistic creative source energy. But then there are all of the spirits that work around that. So there's a big connection to the jinn, the jinnaya, and and how they are fire workings, they are air, they come on the air. So when the wind comes, when we're working with different energies and we're bringing in air, we're bringing in the jinnaya, the jinn. And they are healers. I mean, there's a lot of negative connotations that are kind of surrounding them.
Yeah.
But they are very much spirits that we work with. There's the house jinn, there's the jinn of place. There's different hierarchies kind of within that. And there are different elements that we'll use if we need particular workings done, like amber is one of those ones that, and not the perfume amber, but actual like gemstone amber that we break down to burn.
Into a powder. Yes.
Exactly.
Slavic people use that as an incense to connect with their ancestors.
That particular, they love it. They love the smell. There's not much of a smell, actually. It has a very specific kind of.
It does.
Yeah, it's hard to explain. It's not perfumey like the way you would think of amber perfume.
No,
but anyway, elementals, the way that we work with them is very similar, I feel like, the Italians and the Persians, even though the way that they're described might be slightly different, our actual practices kind of overlap. So when we're calling in, like my grandmother would use the same plants that my Italian grandmother would to do some of the same workings. And they didn't, they only knew each other a very short time because my Italian grandmother passed away and my Persian grandmother lived until just a few years ago. So she was on this planet until she was 94.
Wow.
Yeah, and so the ways that, for example, rue, I think is an excellent plant to kind of connect the two traditions. We have the ruta mater, which is the mother rue, the rue that the Italians use for the most part. And then there's the Persian rue, which is esfand, which is wild rue. And it's kind of almost a masculine type of energy that comes with the Persian rue. Okay. And the Italian rue is a very feminine, motherly aspect of rue. Nice. But we use them in the same way to often ward or to clear out negative energy or to protect from the evil eye or to just really help move energy out that we no longer need in our sphere. And we do all of that with fires. So we bring in the fire element when we're working with rue, for example, the esfand. And finally, in Persian, in Farsi, jinn is what we would say for the jinn, but there's also another word for them is rue. So the same word as the plant. And because there's this connection there with it will move them on the air or will bring them in, it can call them or it can move them back out. So there's, am I explaining this right?
Yes, no, totally. I just want to clarify the name because of a little bit of a transmission delay, the name of the root that is also a sort of another name for the jinn within it was I didn't hear it.
It's rue.
Rue.
Like the rue. Like what like the plant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes, and in Farsi we would say esfand, but also rue for both. So there's a lot of overlaps I find between the Italian and the Persian traditions, and the elementals are both very, very important ways that we work. Now, both of my families were not religious in their generations in a traditional sense. Like they didn't, my grandmother did not go to mosque. She did not cover her hair, never had. And even though so her brother was Sa'id, so he would have been of the line of Ali in the tradition, but they really had their own type of spirituality that was, I think, much more connected to Zoroaster and to more primal types of traditions. I think there was something much more, they went to a different layer, I think, of those traditions where they were really connecting it to the elemental movements, to the way that we work with water, the way we work with fire. And those are really the two elements, I think, that are primary in Persian tradition. The other elements are also obviously the vehicles to move energies, but fire and water are the two that I think are the ones that are most focused on that.
Right.
Whereas in Italian, it's kind of all of it. It's really, we look at all of them as equal, and we look at all of them as interacting. Whereas I found at least in my family's way of looking at things, my mother worked primarily, she would bring in the fire when we were clearing things out, when we were shifting energies, when we were calling in different jinn as workings. Now, the water would have been more for her, at least. She had connections to the angelic realms. She was very connected to angels, very connected to angels. And so for her, when she was doing water work, she would bring in rose petals, cardamom, the water bowl, all of these different things. And those would be part of that speaking with the angel or God, or she would just call God.
What was that word? Sorry, God.
God.
Oh, God. For God.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she did call God Allah, like she did use Allah, but she was not. She had her ways, and her ways were passed down from her mom, from her grandmother. It was kind of all the way back.
Right.
And
So,
in that Persian side, you, because you're talking about many areas of subject matter that interest me greatly, and are sort of a focus of years of cross cultural research and integration, and trying to rescue some of the elements that that are in Afro-Cuban Ifa and other things, so that people have a more global vision of the geomancy and everything else, as well. On the topic of geomancy, was it ever spoken? Did anybody speak of the term geomancy
No.
in any type of the man or any type of Nancy in the Persian, on your Persian side?
No, I don't think they did. And I wonder though, I feel like sometimes some of what my grandmother said was she would censor herself a lot after coming here right before the revolution. I think what was happening in Iran was very traumatic. And I think because of that, she felt unsafe talking about some of those things. So I think she kept it. Yeah. And so I think she kept it to speaking in a more veiled type of a way. She would very openly talk about her connection with angels. She would very openly talk about her connection with God, with spirit. She would also very openly talk about how no man, as in the ayatollahs or the mullahs, was going to tell her what to do.
Good for her.
Yeah.
And that's really important to understand and to know, because a lot of people, I think, look as modern Iran as being very much under Muslim rule and everything. But what people forget is that back in the 60s, Iran was very modern. I mean, like, women, they had a voice. They wore modern clothes. They were very much a part of what the rest of the world was getting into, wearing mini skirts, etc. And it wasn't until this horrible sort of revolution of, monotheistic, Islamic rule that people forget that women were very much a part of the society and had a voice, and there was no way they were going to be told. I worked with a few Iranian women, and they were very strong women, and there was no way. I mean, they left Iran because of what had happened, and they had a very strong voice in their family, right?
And I think, for my grandmother was very much the center of the family, and she, it was funny because there's this tradition. Well, there's Nowruz, which is coming up here on the 20th, 21st of March, which is our New Year. And one of the aspects of the sofre, which is the table that we set up that has all of the different symbolic aspects of the New Year, you're supposed to put a holy book on the table. And for years, she put her mother's Quran, or her grandmother's Quran, which was this beautiful, all calligraphy, just incredible book. And she was so angry. This was maybe 10 or 15 years ago with what was happening, in the world in the name of Islam. She was just so angry about the whole thing that she put her book away, and she said, no, this is not what it's about. And so she always put out a book of Rumi poems. So for her, Rumi was very important as well. So she put out a book of Rumi poems, and she's like, this is my God. I find my God in these poems. I find my spirit in these words. So that will be the holy book. And poetry is a huge part of Iranian culture, like storytelling and poetry. And I think her brother, was my great uncle, was one of the best poetry, like storytellers I've ever heard. Sit around the table after dinner, and part of the tradition is you drink your tea and you have cookies, and someone will pick up a thread and recite a poem. And some of these poems were, could last for an hour, but he just had a way of saying them where we would just all become kind of enthralled. And that is magic to me.
Storytelling, absolutely.
And that thread that kind of connects all of us and will bring in that circle of energy around a table. Like when we're doing those things, we're creating something that is not just in the present moment, but something that endures and something that creates this incredible connection.
And family and tradition and food,
Food's a big one for Persians and Italians.
And Polish, the Slavic. I sat here as you were talking, and I put Slavic because we have Slavic people. I really do believe we have a very strong link to the Iranian, the ancient Iranian past.
So my grandmother's mother was Russian, technically, because she was from the very, very north. But her father was Persian. So she had, red hair and blue eyes.
I dated an Iranian man whose mother was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and he said, my mother looked like you, which I was always like, okay. But, I understood what he was saying, and on a deeper level because of that link, ancestrally, right? And again, with Italians, because Poland at one time had an Italian queen. And she brought a lot of tradition. So a lot of our food overlaps, which some people don't know that. And I think that kind of sort of, panned out to other Slavic countries. So like I said, I sat here and I put Slavic and I put an arrow to Iranian and an arrow over to Italian, something, that I could link to, so thank you for that. And
yeah, of course. And I hope I hope I answered the elemental question.
So in the absence of the word or formal geomancy, what other systems of divination was it just spirit, like basically hearing spirit, and spirit would, but when faced with either decisions, challenges, illness, or other situations, what, or if, in terms of understanding the path or guiding children or next generation on their path and giving them insight, would they look at things like palmistry or cartomancy or basically reading tea leaves, water, or scrying?
For my Persian side, for my grandmother, she would consider herself a conduit. So in her way of doing things, if someone needed healing, if there was something happening in the family, or if she needed guidance, she prayed 5 times a day. She would go into her room and she would cover her head with white, which was very important for the top of her head. She would cover, usually in a type of she could even use a sheet, like it didn't really matter. That was part of it. And she would talk directly. And so we always said, grandma had a direct line to the other things. And so she would come back. So she would very specifically say too that she used her body to transmute what was coming through. Sometimes she would get sick, and there was a bit of a payoff, I think you could say, when someone else would make an immediate turnaround on their health, but grandma would be knocked out for like 3 days, usually through fever. So I think she was calling in considerable amount of fire and air type of energies, and then it would take a bath to be able to move that cooling, healing type of energy out. So she really used her body as the mat. On my Italian side, it was much more practical. I think we used tea, we used cards. My uncle was a tarot reader, and we used playing cards primarily. Regular, he had a deck of tarot cards too, but he liked the old Minchiati, which there's some translation issues with that one. Minchiati deck, which kind of means bullshit, I think would be the closest translation, but it comes from a mistranslation. It really is supposed to mean twins, which has a whole aspect to our traditions too. Twins are kind of an important one. But on the Italian side, they were much more cartomancy, tassomancy, things that had more of a physical incarnation. The Persian side, and this is, quite possibly could just be my grandmother, the way she did things, it was physical transmutation for her body. And it took a toll. I mean, there would be moments when,
she herself would be physically
not
affected.
And then she'd, come back, but it was almost like she saw it as a trade.
I wanted to ask you along those lines of divination. I knew there was a lady that used to do belly dancing in my old neighborhood, and her mother actually used to come to the studio, and she would read coffee grounds. That's what she did, and they were of Iranian background, and she would actually read coffee grounds, and she was very accurate and but I could tell that there was more of a link spiritually than just reading the ground. She'd read them, and then she'd kind of like her eyes would flutter up, and you knew and you felt it. She was connecting with spirit immediately.
I think that's the thing with I have heard of other Persians using the coffee. My grandmother, though, she never drank coffee. She only drank tea. She never drank alcohol, except for one time in Mexico, which was hilarious because she got my dad's margarita instead of the virgin one, and she tasted it and she goes, "This is the best margarita I've ever had." Or lemonade. I think she thought she was ordering lemonade. And my dad was like, "Let me taste that." And he's like, "Mama, that has alcohol in it." She's like, "No, it doesn't."
No, that's mine now.
So, I mean, there's a lot of that. But I have heard of other Persian families that we know using coffee. She really, it was her body.
Right. She used that. I wanted to read what Krisha, what Kristina Przybylska has to say here. I came in late. Is Andrea familiar with the Night Battles by Ginsberg, an anthropologist on Italian tradition of out-of-body travelers. Fighting. It's small writing. Sorry, guys. Fighting evil, and is she connected to any of that practice? Slavic and Persians share some of the same deities, like Smirgal. Yes. Okay. Sorry. So that's kind of long, but
I think I'm not familiar with it, but now I'm going to look it up because now I'm all curious.
Yeah, no, Krisha's great at stuff like this. She pulls things out of the air and it's like, boom, there you go, right? Have you heard about this, right? But anyway.
For my grandmother, like there was this, she talked a lot about angelic energies that she worked with. And I think there was a continuum in the same, very similar with the Italians, but we didn't really see, there was this connection between dark and light that is not, it's not polarity in the negative and the positive, in the sense that it's one is bad, one is evil, and one is good. There was much more of a nuanced connection to those particular energies. So I didn't necessarily feel like we didn't really talk about evil. I think, but we weren't religious. So I feel like some of that comes from some of the religious traditions that might have overlapped those cultures. Because, for example, my Italian side, my Italian grandmother was very interested in New Thought and some of those early 20th century traditions that were coming out of Austria and then later here. And so she was much more interested in the facets of, I think she would never have used this term herself. Like she would never have called herself a Luciferian. Like that would not be something she would have ever said. But there was this thought of the own mind and how we work and how we are sovereign and how we use these different energies to shift things, and how we are very much kind of outside of the reach of dogma, if you will.
Right.
Part of our ways, we never went to church. No one was baptized. We weren't, which was very odd at the time, and very much not, we were baptized in our ways, but not in the church. And so when I went to later on, my parents, so funny, sent me to Catholic all girls high school. And I found it fascinating, and I actually loved learning from the nuns because I had really great nuns, and they were not the meanies, like they were really interesting women. And so that's how I connected with saintly energies, was learning through that as well. But that came way later, and so I was able to kind of look at that from the way I was raised, which there was no guilt, there's no sin, there's no, there is responsibility, huge responsibility. Because
which is nice. Which is a lot more evolved spiritually.
There's just more personal responsibility and responsibility to community. So you can't just be absolved of what you do. And so I think that is kind of where that came in. And and so I don't know. So I don't know. Evil was somewhat. Like I remember in middle school, kids telling me that this was when the Gulf War started, that my grandmother was going to burn in hell because
right.
And I'm like, really? Because first of all, we don't really believe in that, but whatever. I just kind of was like, it was so peculiar to me. I didn't even take it necessarily that personally. I was just kind of like, that's really sad that that's how you feel. That there's this weight on their shoulders of hell, that it's like this looming thing. Whereas, and fear, so much fear that kind of engendered. Whereas I never had fear of the spirit world or.
Interesting. Yeah.
Now, there's certain entities I don't work with. I just don't feel connected to them. And they're not, I think for my particular path, I have and my mother as we both are very connected to the plant world. And that's just how,
Right.
how we work. Like my mom sings lullabies to her seeds as they grow. She talks to them. They grow 3 times faster than anyone else's. And they get huge because she loves them and they love her. And there's this communion.
Nice.
And when we cut them, we promise them that we will take care of their babies and we will raise the next generation of
Right.
their particular
Next
plants. So they will
generation.
continue. So I don't know. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense to me.
And so I don't want raising my child. I know she'll be confronted with those aspects of the world as I was. I think we're in a different time now. Things are definitely moving
Yes,
very
we are.
fast. And I think there's a lot more openness to different ways of perceiving what we experience. My uncle, the one who inspired my first book, was a physicist as well as a practitioner in the Italian ways. And he really had a very solid belief that that all of these things that we experience and that we work through do have, well, I'm not going to say a scientific explanation, but a point and a purpose that we can better understand through science, and that that our entire system of how we use time is in a linear fashion is flawed. And I feel like so many traditions that are like the Persians, like I believe, I'm not sure because I don't have much experience, but with Ifa, there's a more circular or a more connected sense of time. And so his belief was that this was something that was very much, as far as like time travel or out of body travel, that we were getting to these points where we were going to understand more about how that worked with our magic. And I think that's why I love math so much, because it's just another language of the universe. And when there were certain spells that are very typical in Italian tradition, and I was noticing the patterns that were very similar to like a Fibonacci series, where there were reductions and increases like by different iterations. And so I would look at those and go, oh, wow. So our Italian ancestors, like 500 years ago, were using this spell, they were using this work. But this is something that is also can be broken down into a language of mathematics in certain ways.
Right. Right.
Okay, very interesting. Very interesting.
Fascinating. Fascinating, the connection with math, which people always think is so very left-brained or very right-brained. Sorry.
But don't you think that's a way of kind of polarizing everything and putting them into boxes? Is nothing's connected when everything is connected?
Oh, and Claire wants to say.
Oh,
sorry.
Go ahead. No, sorry. Read Claire's comment if you want.
All makes sense to me. I talk to my seeds, plants, trees, etc., the animals. That's right, because Claire has a beautiful garden up here. I had the privilege of seeing that lovely garden, and I know her connection to her plants and that. So thank you, Claire, for making your comment there. Absolutely.
And all of that overlaps too. Like when we think about, I wrote a piece last year about foxglove and hummingbirds, and how there is the interconnection. Hummingbirds love the deep-throated flowers so they can reach the pollen. They love foxglove, and how foxglove digitalis has been used in medicine for heart conditions, and how there's this beautiful symmetry of how hummingbirds have one of the fastest heartbeats, and they are attracted to that flower, and just all of these ways that we interconnect on these simple, what may seem as very mundane or very simplistic, but really it's this whole mosaic of life that is beautifully interconnected. And
absolutely, like a network.
It is. And everything is moving with spirit. So there's no, I mean, for me, I don't feel that disconnect where some might look at a plant as an object. To me, it's a relationship.
Yes. No, it's true. as I sit here and look at my plants. Someone's moving. But anyway, Jean-Jerome, did you have any other questions?
I'm going to sum up in the interest of time.
Okay. Right.
In the interest of time, I'm going to just ask one sort of last question, and then because we don't want to abuse your time, and so you can take care of your beautiful daughter. This has been a very interesting talk. I think we could even do a part 2 on this.
I would love to.
Sure. I can see part 2, and let's get Michael in on this.
I was going to say, let's get John Michael in here. I love, all he has to say has been so influential and such a huge connection for me in my life.
No, absolutely, he has.
Absolutely. As I hear you speak, and as I hear you describe the plants and nature, and also even things like expressed through your jewelry, or even the way you describe all the interactions, all that. I have to ask you a question, and what is within the Italian, also within the Persian heritage, when it comes to nature, when it comes to spirits of nature? We talked about, the plants having a consciousness and a spirit of being realized. But I'm looking for a very specific target of type of spirituality. And I'll preface it as well as that within the diaspora and the Ifa and all that, quite often the orisha of nature, of plants and all that, which is called Osain, which is supposed to be is described as the owner of the plants and the custodian of everything which has to do with plants, animals, and so forth. What sometimes in the diaspora is not known is that Osain has in the diaspora is oftentimes depicted as male, right, and deformed because of a war with another elemental, if you will, which was Shango. Okay, where Shango basically, it's a long story, but anyways, let's just say he was deformed. But one thing that is known in Nigeria, in Oyo and all that, Osain is actually, there are, like in many things in Ifa, there's a masculine and a feminine. Although in this case, the masculine takes on the majority of the attention, there are feminine paths of Osain. In other words, there is a female manifestation of Osain. In the transliteration of that, which right now, if any Babalawo or Laurishas are there, probably like, what? What are
you talking about?
Well, what are you talking about? But one of the in terms of language and in terms of use of language, Osain is in his feminine manifestation, or that energy's feminine manifestation. One of its forms in English, in terms of the translation or the description, is described as a beautiful wood sprite, or essentially also a fae. My question to you, with that big lead up or build up, is what is the concept or the description, or even the recognition of a spiritual class, a spiritual being called fae?
Well, let's see, how do I say this? For the Italian side, I think the Italian side might be more straightforward. There is Faunus, of course, is the god of the forest, and he's considered to be the voice of the forest. And sometimes it's connected to Pan. There's a lot of different connections that go back to that. In my family, one of the plant spirits that we are most connected to, and this is where I'm going to get to the fae part, but it is the lilac. And the lilac,
my favorite plant.
It's a very powerful spirit, very powerful plant. And if you go back to some of the ancient stories about Faunus and how he was, or Pan, I think in this particular story, was attracted to Syringa. That is, Lila Syringa, that's the name of the plant. But it actually was a forest spirit, a fae, a nymph, if you will, forest nymph. And she transformed herself into the lilac to get away from his advances. because she wasn't interested. And he couldn't find her, but he found the lilac plant, and he broke off a little branch and he turned that into his flute to become part of the song of the forest. So for us, the lilac is our representation. Lilac spirit, lilac plant, lilac bushes are a big part of our particular tradition. In fact, here's my last year we dried lilac.
Nice.
So the lilac spirit to us is a way of naming, I guess, if you will, one of the fae, one of the elements that we work with. In some ways, maybe we are part of that line somehow. Some of the journey work that has come through and some of the things that my grandmother on the Italian side has shared, and great-grandmother, has been the concept that the grape, for example, which is also very important for both traditions, the grapevine, the grape spirit, the grape plant, which Bacchus or Faunus are connected to in the spirit realm or in the personification of those particular gods. That we were birthed, or we came from those plants and not from those gods. That the plants came first and the gods were birthed of the plants. If that makes sense. So there's
it makes a lot of sense to anybody who follows the Ifa Vodun tradition, because we say there is no Orisha, there is no god without the plant. And each Orisha is basically birth. In other words, initially washed and given its genesis through picking the plants that resonate with the energy or the consciousness of that Orisha. So that makes perfect sense to Orisha version. Yeah.
And that's how we perceive it. And that was a very clear message that came through, that was something, that my grandmother planted in our Port Townsend home. They had 4 acres-ish, and there was a border all the way around of lilacs, all different colors. And every year, every spring, we make a potion, a lilac protection potion. And this is in my second book too. It is it is a protective potion. It's something that we wear, we spray over our head. Everything goes, here, up here first. And then we can, spray your room, we can put it on clothes, we can do all of these things. We protect babies, children with it because they're so open. We have to do a lot of work around them to keep them safe, and working with only spirits that are appropriate for them. And so every year as a family, and this was the first year we didn't do it, this past spring, we did it. We were still at the farm with my parents and cut the lilacs. We cut it. They were on the porch, and my mom hung all of them on her side, and then I took them home and did the distillation instead of doing it together in the kitchen like we would normally do. But we make about 150 bottles, and they sell out within like a week because it's it's become so popular over the years. This is something that goes all the way back to our Italian side, and one of my cousins in Italy made the potion this year because we're all separated in tandem in Italy. And so it's lilacs, and it has other particular herbs that we use that protect from, and this is going to be my great-grandmother's words, vampires. So vampire, parasitic energy, anything parasitic.
Right.
Clears it out. Like some of my friends, and pardon my language, they call it bitch be gone, but I don't know if my grandma would call it that, but
I know that one. Bitch be gone, yeah.
Right. And it's incredibly powerful. And so Violette did my daughter did her very first potion with the lilacs when she was 2. That was her first time. And it was like a gathering. We had, all of our friends came that are not at all witchy or anything. They just were part of our Oh, there's Jean-Michael talking about the lilacs. And, she was there with other 2-year-olds, and they're all picking the flowers and eating them. And there's a joyfulness, life, vitality that is in that plant spirit and that plant mother that is walking with us and helping us every year. So
Absolutely.
One of our traditions.
I have an affinity for lilac and have for years. I used to have 2 big lilac bushes in my small little garden in the city that I absolutely loved. That is no longer, but I loved lilac.
Before we wrap up too, and I just want to say one thing, because it's winter and people are home and, in some places there's a lot of snow and we don't have those plants with us right now. Right. That doesn't mean you can't call in the spirit of lilac to sit
Absolutely.
with you. They're everywhere, and they are all, even when they're sleeping.
Absolutely.
And I love you, John Michael. So good to see your
yes, John Michael. It was so nice for him to pop in and give us his input there. So anyway, so yes, in the interest of time, I think we're going to wrap up. I so enjoyed this talk, and I know I speak for everybody who tuned in, and just thank you so much for coming on board, Andrea. I look forward to more discussions, private discussions, things like that with you and with Jean-Michael for sure. And so I want to take this time to say thank you again to you, Jean-Jerome, for holding everything in the back there and putting up with all the technical stuff and everybody's input. And yes, love you too.
I'll get you guys a link for Inner Alchemy Collective too. I'll get that over to you.
Absolutely, yes, please.
If anybody wants to pop on and just take a look, because it's really special, I think.
It is. I think it is. And I think there's some really good and interesting things that are going to be coming that way.
Is that on Facebook or is that the website?
The website, the actual Inner Alchemy, yeah.
If you tell me right now, I can quickly.
Maybe John Michael could pop the link into the comments if he's still watching. Because I know there was a specific one where you guys can do the free, pop around and look at everything.
Right.
I mean, you could even easily do the first module of my class. You don't need 7 days. You could go through, just take a look and kind of experience it. But yeah, and thank you, everyone. I see such lovely comments. It's been so beautiful and
they have been. They've been absolutely beautiful and positive in that. And so I want to say thank you to everybody who tuned in. Claire, thank you for all your comments and everyone. So we're going to say goodbye at this time. I've got impatient dogs who are looking at me, one in particular who I keep pushing away, putting the microphone on mute, telling her to sit down, lay down, stop. So if you see me making faces, it's me trying to connect with her because she's connecting with me. But anyway, let's put up the link there, Jean-Jerome. And oh my goodness.
Yeah, so the Inner Alchemy, there we've got our little mascot, friend mascot, Mojo and Titi Laye, which are watching the show for, they watched us all like the fall of 2020, and now these are Beth and Rob's kittens. So they watch our show attentively, so we have to give a shout out for them. And again, thank you, Jean-Michael, inneralchemy.online collective. So, for anybody who wants to check that out. And again, it's been a pleasure very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you
absolutely.
So much. I really appreciate it. And I just really appreciate having this space to talk with you guys, and especially about things that I love and just adore both of you. So that's been great. And 2 hours just flew by, and I know my daughter's going to be like, what are you
doing? Waiting. Well, I thank you, and thank you, daughter, for allowing us to take you away from her. And Beth wants to say, They send their regrets. They missed the first couple of shows this year. Ah, right. Okay. Well, that's okay. They're allowed. And so again, I want to say thank you to everybody who tuned in. I'm sure you all enjoyed meeting Andrea and getting a chance to talk to her a little bit more in depth and some wonderful ways to connect. So
Absolutely.
I just want to say
And
goodbye
stay
to
tuned for a
everybody.
part 2 of this. So,
That's
John
great.
Michael,
Part
if
two.
you're hearing us now, if you're hearing this show right now, both you and Andrea, we do a part 2, expanding a little bit on some of these topics and doing a little bit more on the
The inner
comparative side, sort of like a
and the
round
inner
table discussion.
alchemy,
I love
the
it.
inner
And
alchemy collective,
exactly,
and talking about that
exactly,
for sure. So
exactly.
yes, so everybody, thank you. And thank you for all the good comments and everyone who tuned in. So I'm going to say goodbye because I got to go.
Yeah.
I'm getting the look again here on this end. So
Well, Dabo, bye bye, everybody. Thank you so much for
Bye.
tuning in, and thank you so much, Andrea, for being on the
do
show.
widzenia.
Thanks, you
Do
And
guys.
thanks,
widzenia,
Teresa.
everybody.
Excellent job.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
You too,
Cheers. Bye bye.
Jean-Jerome. Bye.
Bye bye, everybody.